Hey YouTube, so this is the second video in my nonfiction booktubing that's related to the same book. So I will try to link in the card above the previous video, but this is another one about the book Queering Gay and Lesbian Studies, and you can see my sort of brief review description of the book in the first video. But what we're going to talk about today is the topic of the relationship between gender and sexual orientation. Is there a relationship? If so, what is it? So I think most people today, if you wanted to really boil down and simplify, the way that this is being taught, the way that most people learn this, is that gender is who you are and sexual orientation is about who you want. So it's kind of a subject-object distinction. Your gender is your internal self-identity, and your orientation is who are you romantically, sexually, or otherwise attracted to. So they're the object of that verb, whichever specific verb you want to use. And that, sure. If you gotta boil it way down. Yeah, there are many ways you could problematize that, but I'll take it. But I was thinking, in more detail about what the relationship is between these two, in myself and others, because I don't think that they are that starkly divided, especially thinking historically. And so in this book, Queering Gay and Lesbian Studies, there's an example of how sort of the idea of a healthy gay person being conforming to gender, the idea that in order to be healthy, and they talk specifically about an old diagnosis in the DSM-3, I believe, 4? DSM-3 or 4, I can't remember, but the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the book that psychiatrists use to diagnose mental health stuff. There was and I don't know if it's still in there, I don't think it is, but there was a time at which, when they were in the same sweep as removing homosexuality as a disorder, there was an addition of childhood gender dysphoria, I think? Gender identity disorder. I can't remember the name of he talks about it in the book, but I can't remember the name of the diagnosis. But basically, there was a swap out, and there's a lot of discussion in the book of how the idea was that it was okay to be gay, but there was kind of a backdoor weirdness where kids who are, for example, an effeminate boy might be treated under this, and it's essentially preempting or trying to avoid somebody becoming gay, or at least becoming a certain type of gay. And so the idea is that a healthy gay adult conforms to their gender. And it struck me because it's very similar for trans care, or at least has been in recent years similar for trans care. The idea is that in order to be a healthy trans man or trans woman specifically, you have to conform to way beyond what cis people are expected to conform to in terms of gender standards. And it was really bad at the beginning, and I think it's getting better, but there's still some of this where trans people feel that in order to get surgery, hormones, other things they need medically or legally, that they have to present a certain image of male or female to be accepted as such. You can, in order to hop over from one to the other, you have to present as an extreme version of the other. And of course, this excludes non-binary people entirely. So I was just struck by the similarity there. In the book, there's some discussion of how basically there was this older idea of so there's just juxtaposition discussed in the book, where you have in historically, and I can't remember the exact decades that this is described, I can guess, but I'm not quite sure. But there was this idea that up until a point, maybe up until around 1980s, this idea that gender nonconformity and homosexuality go together. So you're probably familiar with this. The idea of the stereotype of the effeminate gay man, the butch dyke. So the idea that part and parcel of normative gender is also heterosexual desire. So particularly before widespread acceptance, of homosexuality and other kinds of queerness, in order to, like, part of the definition of man was likes women, and part of the definition of women was likes man. And so if you were gay, there was this assumption that is non-normative gender, and it linked together other kinds of stereotypes about non-normative gender. And then you have this newer idea around the 80s and 90s, like, where, particularly I think in gay male circles, but I've seen it as well in lesbian circles, the idea of hypermasculinity. So the gay gym buff stereotype, the idea that the no fats, no femmes thing, which you may have heard of in the gay personal ads, where suddenly it was like, you had to not just conform, but in the book there's a discussion of hyper gender, hyper masculinity. So not just conforming, but actually going like over the top. So it's not trying to hide necessarily, like hide orientation in a conforming gender, but it's actually going above and beyond. And I think the same thing can happen with like hyper femme identity. Maybe not as much, but I have seen some, like, there was some pushback around the same period, maybe later into the 90s and 2000s, against the butch lesbian idea. And or even like in a positive way. Jessica Calgren-Fozard describes this, and I think it's lovely and charming, but kind of makes a joke about, like, why would people assume that a really femme person like her is straight? Because she likes everything feminine, including girls. And that's fair, right? Like, that's one, interpretation of femme could be that. But part of that was like that you can be gender normative and you can be gay. And then if you look at queer communities, I think it gets a lot squishier. How gender and orientation relate. But I guess, like, I wonder if there is something to the idea that gay or lesbian could be normalized if you parallel them to heterosexuality. So the idea would be, so if heterosexuality is liking a particular gender, that you could, in theory, say, I'm gay or I'm lesbian, I like one gender, just like you, I like one gender, and I have one partner within my gender choice. So that's like a monogamous, specifically gay or lesbian. And if you try to parallel it like that, and that's the normative, like, angle, then even bisexuality problematizes that, right? Because, for that matter, even straight polyamory would problematize that. But, bisexuality would, well, now you no longer like one gender, just like the other person. So if you think of, like, like an argument for gay rights, the very conservative argument for gay rights could be, like, I'm just like you, I want to marry somebody within my gender choice, so, like, let me do that. Well, what about bisexual people? And then, of course, what about queerness? And what about, what about if you're like me, if your own gender is kind of squishy, or my gender is pretty firm, but it's not male or female. So you could say squishy, you could just say, whatever, like, non-binary gender. If you're a non-binary subject, then how does gay, lesbian, any of that work for you? So, like, this book talks a little bit about, talks about one example, specifically in SM communities, as an example that kind of destabilizes gender categories and sexual orientation, because rather than being attracted necessarily to a gender, and, like, gender being the important thing, and you're attracted to one of those, like, that model, and even beyond being attracted to two or more of those, it destabilizes things by having sexuality be maybe a little more fluid and gender maybe a little more performative. If your choice in an SM community is that you like people who are on the S side or the M side, then gender might become less important. And I thought this was interesting because my own experience is that I'm not really attracted to people by gender so much. I'm more attracted, if anything, I guess I'm more attracted to a particular presentation. So, like, I'm attracted to all sorts of queer femmes. I date outside of that, but, like, if you wanted to pick my type, it would definitely be queer femme of some description. And not necessarily particularly high femme. I personally love the term lazy femme. Disability thing. But to me, like, femme love, femmes together is like a really exciting thing for me and something I really like and I'm drawn to, and I don't necessarily know why. But it doesn't have to do with the person's gender. So the idea of sexual orientation being based on gender is not as relevant to me. And I don't know how much my own gender is relevant to my orientation, except in the fact that because of my gender, I don't have an easy marker to use, and so I use queer, but queer is also useful to me because gender is not the axis on which I define my attraction. And the other thing that is discussed is, in the example in the book, is like things being more about sexual practice than identity. So there's a discussion of how in the SM community, like, it's more about what you want to do with somebody, possibly, than how the label you put upon yourself. And that, like, activity only has gendered meaning if you intentionally add it in. That all sorts of sexual activities that run the gamut could be gendered or could be not. So there's this feeling in this community of, like, more flexibility, fluidity, not necessarily assigning meaning that is inherent to an activity, which I think is cool, and definitely how I approach sexuality in general. So looping back around to the question, like, are gender and sexual orientation related? I think the answer is yes, they are, but they are related differently for different people, and the more you get away from the norm, the more you might have to, might not be words for the thing you want to describe, and therefore it all might all get mixed up in a blender, I guess. So anyway, that's the second video on this book. Please feel free to leave comments with your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe. I will be doing a third video on this book, and then some more of this nonfiction booktube fun coming on the channel.